Ron Strickland. This webcast is one of a series in which I'm presenting some brief lectures and commentaries on topics from the courses I teach in literature and cultural studies. This particular installment is one I prepared for my course called Studies in the Novel, and here I'll be saying some things about Jane Austen's novel, Pride and Prejudice. In another webcast, I've identified some specific conventions that distinguish the modern novel from other earlier forms of narrative, such as the traditional epic. I'll discuss 4 of these distinctive characteristics of the modern novel here. First, that the novel is designed to be read in private by an individual reader in isolation, as opposed, for instance, to the traditional epic, which is the product of an oral culture and is designed to be sung or recited in communal settings, performed in public before live audiences. Along with these changes in the material conditions of the production and consumption of narrative represented by the modern novel, we can see a definite shift in the kinds of topics focused on or emphasized in this new form of narrative. For instance, as opposed to the warrior hero in the traditional epic, in the modern novel, the main character is most often an ordinary person facing some challenges that we might identify with. And we, as readers, are intimately drawn in to the experience of the main character or the protagonist. This happens through a process that is called interiority, where the thoughts and feelings of the character are shared with the reader. The reader has access to what the character is thinking or feeling, not simply viewing what the character is doing, but in some way or another, living the experience with the character. Another related convention that I mentioned in the earlier video is a very familiar subgenre or kind of a modern novel called a Bildungsroman. It's a German word relating to the process of growing up of a young person, the process by which one gains some deeper understanding of society, of the wider world, and becomes a competent adult. I'll be calling attention to these conventions of the modern novel, among others, as I share with you some general observations on Pride and Prejudice. I can think of no way better than to begin by looking at the very first sentence of the novel. It is a truth universally acknowledged, the novel begins, that a single man in possession of a good fortune must be in want of a wife. Notice the very modest, even domestic agenda of this plot, as it's announced ironically in the first sentence. The goal of supplying a rich young bachelor with a good wife. Compare that to the quest of a traditional epic, like Beowulf slaying monsters to defend the kingdom, or the epic narrative of Aeneas's adventure after the defeat and the fall of Troy, his many adventures and battles, leading finally, as prophesied, to the founding of Rome. Here's how the Aeneid begins. Arms and the man I sing, who, forced by fate and haughty Juno's unrelenting hate, expelled and exiled left the Trojan shore. Long labors both by sea and land he bore, and in the doubtful war, before he won the Latian realm and built the destined town, his banished gods restored to rights divine, and settled sure succession in his line, from whence the race of Alban fathers come, and the long glories of majestic Rome. Like the Aeneid, the opening of Pride and Prejudice tells us what the novel is going to be about. But in contrast to the grandeur, the exalted significance of an epic, the goal of this novel is much more circumscribed. And there's an irony, if you think about it, in contrasting the opening of Pride and Prejudice with these grand epic narratives of the classical tradition. The sentence begins to give us some information about the main character of the novel, Elizabeth Bennet, a young woman who, along with her 4 sisters, is presumed to be in need of finding a husband, and of her quest of finding that husband and achieving a happy marriage. We don't know yet who is speaking this first sentence, but it will soon become clear that this is an unnamed outside observer relating the actions and the unspoken thoughts and feelings of all of the characters in the novel. This is called a third-person omniscient narrative, in which the narrator can move freely among the perspectives of the different characters, presenting to us, the reader, the motives and the intentions and the reactions of each character in turn. However, in this particular novel, the third-person omniscient or all-knowing narrator is not perfectly omniscient, because the narrator generally gives us the perspective of Elizabeth Bennet, the protagonist, and in 1 or 2 occasions, the unspoken thoughts of Mr. Darcy, thoughts that can't be known by Elizabeth. The fact that the narrative is generally presented from Elizabeth's point of view becomes important because there are some things that Elizabeth doesn't know, some presumptions of hers that turn out to be wrong and lead her to prejudice. The novel also presents direct dialogue among and between the characters, and character traits are revealed and developed in these dialogues. This use of a third-person narrator shifting among the perspectives of different characters and alternating between third-person narration and direct dialogue is a technique that literary critics call free indirect discourse, or free indirect narrative. The voice telling the story is not limited to one consciousness, but can move freely and seamlessly among different perspectives in a way that is not disruptive to the reading experience. Jane Austen is sometimes identified as the first novelist to use this technique, and she is seen as an expert at the use of free indirect narration. We don't know yet who is speaking this first sentence, but it will soon be evident that the narrator is an unnamed, unidentified, third-person storyteller, not Elizabeth Bennet telling us her story in her own words directly. But it will also become clear that this narrator is limited to Elizabeth Bennet's perspectives. So even though it's a third-person narrator, the novel produces that sense of interiority that I mentioned by sharing with us just what Elizabeth thinks, just what Elizabeth knows, just what Elizabeth feels. And sometimes she thinks she knows more than she really knows. And that's where the feature of Bildungsroman comes in this novel. The novel engages us in the formation of Elizabeth Bennet's adult, mature identity, and also shows us some other characters who are gaining in self-knowledge, in knowledge of other people, in knowledge of the wider world, albeit a world that is specifically a small world. It is indeed a very small world. The setting is a couple of villages and manorial estates. The families belong to the rural gentry and the lower aristocracy. They're relatively rich, but not so rich that they don't have to worry about money. The financial well-being of all of these families depends to a great extent on financially advantageous marriages. And that's the source of so much of the novel's rich irony. Absent, for the most part, is any attention to where the money comes from. No one is really working here. They are all simply living on inherited wealth and the rents from the tenants who are working the lands that they own. The most urgent instance of this tension between a romantic, idealistic conception of marriage and the material exigency, the need to marry for money that runs throughout the novel, is the fact that because Mr. Bennet's estate is entailed, and because he and Mrs. Bennet have produced 5 daughters, but not one son who would be eligible to inherit the estate, that property will now be inherited by his cousin, Mr. Collins. It's a complex and drawn-out financial and familial crisis. The novel is packed with clever, ironic commentary on the tension between Elizabeth's romantic idealism and the realistic materialism of almost everyone else around her. On that note, I'll conclude for now. As always, if you have questions or comments, send me an email.